Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Je m'appelle Catherine Lévesque, je serai votre modératrice aujourd'hui. So with us today we have the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry DeMarco, and he will be giving remarks and then answering questions about his office's spring reports. So just a reminder to people on Zoom, if you do have a question, please use the raised hand function so I can unmute you later. So Commissioner, you can go ahead.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Jerry DeMarco et je suis le commissaire à l'environnement et au développement durable du Canada. Je tiens à souligner que nous nous trouvons sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. I am here today to discuss 5 performance audit reports that were presented to Parliament this morning. Together, these 5 reports show that climate change and biodiversity are intrinsically linked and that these 2 crises need to be addressed through decisive and concerted actions. When I look at all of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada's reports that have flagged these grave concerns over the years, it's clear that we have been repeatedly ringing the alarm bells. Now, these bells are almost deafening. Our past audits show that Canada has failed to meet many of its climate and biodiversity targets, and I'm extremely concerned that without a significant shift in approach, this trend will continue. Even if we succeed at reducing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere and restoring natural habitats, there's no coming back from some of the damage that has already occurred. While trees can be replanted, extinct species do not magically come back to life. Nous pouvons tirer les leçons des échecs du passé pour limiter les effets les plus graves des changements climatiques et de la perte de la biodiversité et bâtir un avenir meilleur pour les générations à venir. Ou nous pouvons continuer dans la même voie et léguer à nos enfants les conséquences de nos échecs. Notre premier audit visait à déterminer si Environnement et Changement climatique Canada, Pêche et Océan Canada et Parc Canada avaient respecté les délais de la loi sur les espèces en péril pour élaborer les documents requis pour appuyer le rétablissement des espèces sauvages en péril. Nous voulions aussi savoir si les objectifs établis dans le programme de rétablissement et le plan de gestion avaient été atteints. Overall, we found that the 3 organizations' efforts to plan and report on the recovery of species at risk were slow and lacking, and that objectives were being met for less than half of all species for which there was sufficient data. What this means on the ground is that 416 of the 520 species at risk that have been reassessed since 1982 either showed no change in status or had entered a higher risk category. In other words, in more than 4 decades, the status had improved for only about 1 in every 5 species at risk. We found large backlogs of progress reports that are intended to keep departments accountable and show whether the actions being taken are having a meaningful impact. Of the 399 progress reports that Environment and Climate Change Canada was required to produce, it had completed only 1. Without this ongoing monitoring, the government may miss opportunities to improve outcomes for species. Turning now to our second audit, which also focused on species at risk. We looked at whether the federal government took urgent action when necessary to protect wildlife species and their habitats on non-federal lands. We found that Environment and Climate Change Canada did not have a proactive approach to providing the minister with timely advice on using discretionary emergency powers. Les pouvoirs discrétionnaires prévus par la loi sur les espèces en péril permettent au gouvernement fédéral d'intervenir lorsque les provinces et les territoires ne réussissent pas à protéger efficacement les espèces en péril et leur habitat sur le territoire non fédéral. Depuis que la loi est entrée en vigueur, il y a près de 20 ans, un total de 3 décrets d'urgence ont été pris, et tous sont attribuables à des pressions externes. Le gouvernement fédéral a le pouvoir d'intervenir pour contrer des menaces imminentes pesant sur les espèces, mais il manque d'initiatives et de politiques pour orienter ces actions. Les mesures prises par Environnement et Changement climatique Canada ne reflètent pas l'urgence de la crise de la biodiversité mondiale. Des centaines d'espèces canadiennes sont en péril, depuis le caribou, emblématique figurant sur la pièce de 25 sous, à la chouette tachetée en voie de disparition imminente. Mais il est encore possible de la sauver. J'aborderai maintenant notre audit sur les forêts et le changement climatique. Le gouvernement fédéral a lancé le programme 2 milliards d'arbres pour lutter contre les changements climatiques, améliorer la biodiversité et favoriser le bien-être humain. Nous avons constaté que, compte tenu du nombre d'arbres plantés jusqu'ici, il est peu probable que le programme réussisse, à moins que des changements importants soient apportés. Although Natural Resources Canada nearly met its goal to plant 30 million trees in 2021, the department fell well short of its 2022 goal of 60 million trees. Delays in signing agreements with planting partners not only have significantly challenged the department's ability to plant the number of trees it had planned for 2022, but the delays will also affect subsequent years, which have much more ambitious goals. We also found that Natural Resources Canada, working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, did not provide a clear and complete picture of the role of Canada's forests in greenhouse gas emissions. For example, emissions estimates varied significantly in reports over the years because of recalculations prompted by data updates. This changed whether forests were reported as a net source of emissions rather than capturing emissions, making it extremely difficult to make informed decisions. Je tiens à préciser qu'il est important de ne pas abandonner. Nous devons plutôt nous réorienter pour que des solutions comme le programme 2 milliards d'arbres aboutissent et que nous ayons le tableau complet de l'incidence de nos forêts sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. La restauration des habitats, y compris les forêts, fait partie de la solution à la double crise des changements climatiques et de la perte de la biodiversité. Notre audit de certains règlements sur les gaz à effet de serre a examiné si le Canada avait atteint ses cibles de réduction et contribué aux objectifs nationaux d'atténuation à long terme des changements climatiques. Environnement et Changement climatique Canada ne savait pas dans quelle mesure le règlement sur les gaz à effet de serre que nous avons examiné contribuait à l'atteinte de l'objectif global de réduction des émissions au Canada. L'approche adoptée par le ministère pour mesurer les émissions ne permettait pas d'associer les résultats à des règlements en particulier. Le ministère reconnaissait que ce type d'association est difficile à faire à cause des interactions entre certaines mesures stratégiques. When we looked at individual regulations, we found mixed results. The regulations aimed at reducing emissions from power generation achieved their targets, but some of the regulations that aimed to reduce emissions from vehicles did not. The department was also very slow to develop new regulations, such as regulations about clean fuels. Regulations are an important element of achieving Canada's emission reduction target. However, without comprehensive impact information, the federal government does not know whether it is using the right tools to sufficiently reduce emissions to meet its target. Our last audit examined whether the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions Canada incorporated climate-related financial risks into its risk management systems and frameworks for federally regulated financial institutions and pension plans. Les risques financiers liés au changement climatique prennent différentes formes. Les incendies à Fort McMurray et dans les environs, qui ont occasionné des pertes dévastatrices pour toute la collectivité, en sont un exemple. Lorsque les dommages sont importants, certains propriétaires peuvent avoir de la difficulté à rembourser leurs prêts hypothécaires, ce qui peut entraîner des pertes pour les banques. Cela pourrait amener les banques à réduire les prêts qu'elles consentent, et les assureurs pourraient augmenter les primes. Nous avons constaté que le bureau du surintendant avait récemment réalisé des progrès importants en vue d'intégrer ces risques à son cadre de surveillance, mais la pleine mise en œuvre prendrait des années. De plus, le bureau du surintendant ne considère pas son rôle inclut la promotion des objectifs climatiques plus vastes du gouvernement du Canada. Le bureau du surintendant a l'occasion d'examiner comment il pourrait adapter son rôle afin de contribuer à l'approche pan-gouvernementale du Canada en matière de développement durable et de lutte contre le changement climatique. Il est encourageant de constater que le bureau du surintendant et la communauté internationale des instances de surveillance financière sont conscients des risques que pose le changement climatique pour les institutions financières et l'ensemble du système financier, et qu'ils prennent des mesures pour s'attaquer aux problèmes. Cependant, des mesures s'imposent depuis longtemps, et elles doivent maintenant être prises en urgence. With these most recent reports, the list of failures grows longer yet again. Unlike the obviousness of an immediate pandemic, the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are chronic, insidious, and too often ignored because their gravity becomes apparent primarily over the long term. Government has in place a range of policy tools to better protect wildlife, restore habitats, reduce greenhouse gases, and better prepare for climate change. The question I ask is whether the government will step up for our sake, for nature, and for future generations. Acting now can influence outcomes. As we celebrate Earth Day this weekend, which bears the theme Invest in Our Planet, let's remember that it isn't too late to switch gears and refocus the discussion on achieving targets and reversing the current trend of failure. The findings and recommendations in these reports are part of that discussion. Merci. Je suis prêt à répondre à vos questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Commissaire. Donc, nous allons passer à la période de questions. Je rappelle que nous commençons dans la salle et ensuite nous allons sur Zoom. Donc, pour les personnes sur Zoom, si vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée pour que je puisse vous donner la parole. So, we'll go to questions, starting with questions in the room, then on Zoom. A reminder to use the raised hand function to indicate that you have a question. Et on va commencer avec Valérie Michaela-Bain, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour. Alors, dans quelle mesure est-ce que le fait qu'on n'ait pas réussi à planter ces arbres, que nos objectifs, on est qu'à 2,4 ou 2,3 dans quelle mesure est-ce que ça va nous empêcher d'atteindre nos cibles de réduction de gaz à effet de serre?
Alors, même si on atteint le cible de 2 milliards d'arbres par 2031, on ne va pas atteindre la cible de réduction de gaz à effet de serre que le ministère a prévu pour 2030. Ça va prendre plus longtemps pour atteindre cet objectif, même avec 2 milliards d'arbres par 2030. Et c'est à cause des délais entre le retour de l'investissement de planter des arbres et la façon que le carbone est stocké dans les arbres. C'est encore possible d'atteindre 2 milliards d'arbres par 2031, mais ils ne vont pas atteindre leur cible pour le stockage de carbone par 2030. Ça va aider leur objectif pour 2050.
Justement, de quelle façon est-ce qu'on peut remettre ce programme-là sur les rails d'atteindre le 2 milliards d'arbres d'ici 10 ans? Est-ce que c'est possible? Est-ce que c'est réaliste? Comment est-ce qu'on y arrive?
Oui, il y a encore assez de temps pour rattraper. Notre rapport a beaucoup de recommandations parce qu'on a choisi de regarder ce programme au début au lieu à la fin. Et c'était parce que nous voulons aider le gouvernement à atteindre les cibles et seulement pas regarder après le programme est fini pour déterminer où le problème est et qu'est-ce qui est arrivé pour qu'il ne réussisse pas. Alors oui, c'est possible.
David Thurton, CBC.
Hi, Commissioner. Thanks for taking our questions. You said this in French, but can you say this in English? Is the tree planting program succeeding? As it stands right now, is the government on track to meet the goal of planting 2 billion trees by 2030, 2031?
They are not on track, and we provide recommendations that would allow them to get back on track to meet 2 billion trees by 2031. So it's still possible to catch up. And as I indicated in French, even if they do succeed in planting 2 billion trees by 2031, the greenhouse gas sequestration, carbon sequestration that they predicted for 2030 would not come to pass. Those returns on investment will come in later decades as the trees grow larger. So they can still meet their target for trees planted. They will not be able to meet their target for carbon sequestration by 2030, which means they have to find real reductions elsewhere, whether it's oil and gas, transportation, or something else, to reach their 40 to 45% target by 2030. This program will not help them with 2030.
And so when you did the digging and the probing, why are they not on track? How are they failing?
So these first few years, so they were expecting to ramp up. It wasn't a matter of planting 10% of the trees every year. They're obviously going to plant most of them in the final 5 years because it takes time for the seedlings to be ready to be planted. So, but they did have milestones for each year. They're relatively modest in the first 2 years. The first year they made it just about close enough. Second year, not even close. And the reason is that there are not that many federal lands to plant a lot of trees. They need partnerships with provinces, territories, indigenous communities, municipalities, private sector to deliver on this because it's a federal program, but they don't have the land mass to actually deliver it. So this lack of partnership agreements is what slowed them down. Now that they're starting to ramp those up this week, we've heard news of progress in that regard. Which is positive in terms of the responses to our recommendations. They could still, as I said, put together enough agreements if they have willing partners and catch up to be able to deliver by 2031.
Well, can I have another question? But I asked 2 questions. Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, it seems like you've been, ringing the bell, and the bell is getting deafeningly loud. At this point, when you look at this program, the 2 billion trees, is this just all climate performative greenwashing at this point? If the government, the way the program looks to you right now, does it look like that?
The program is worth doing. What we're saying is that they're not on track to accomplish their planting goal, and they're not on track to have it have any effect on net emissions by 2030. It will have a large effect on net emissions in the decades following as the trees grow larger and they sequester more carbon. So it's still worth doing. It's just not a viable strategy to help them with their 2030 target. On top of that, it's not just about stocking carbon in trees, right? If you do tree planting well, it can provide habitat for biodiversity, species at risk, provide shade in an urban environment, recreational opportunities, and so on. Lots of benefits associated with planting 2 billion trees if done well. I'm disappointed that the only recommendation of the many in our report that wasn't fully agreed is our recommendation about dovetailing tree planting with habitat restoration, so that you're not just planting trees for trees' sake, but you're planting forests, essentially, and creating habitat rather than a tree farm, for example. If they were not looking just at the departmental silos and saying, okay, Natural Resource Canada is in the business of planting these trees, habitat is something for Environment Canada to worry about. They should be working together so that they maximize the objectives of tree planting in a way that also maximizes benefits for biodiversity and human well-being. So it's a worthwhile program if they do it right. If they just plant monocultures of tree plantations, they'll get a little bit of carbon storage and they won't get the other benefits that I just spoke about.
It's just become a PR exercise if they don't take this seriously and do what you say?
Well, they are taking it seriously. If you look at the responses, except for the one that I just mentioned about habitat, the responses to our recommendations indicate that they do want to get back on track. And so I'm not, at year 2 or 3, writing off the program as impossible to achieve. I'm providing recommendations to make sure that they can achieve it. And if they don't have any excuses, because we're telling them early on what needs to be done in order to achieve the 2 billion trees target.
Raymond Fillon, TVA.
Pardon. Nonobstant le programme de plantation d'arbres, l'objectif pour 2030, le gouvernement fédéral, pour ce qui est des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, est-il en voie d'atteindre son objectif, selon vous, ou de le rater?
L'objectif pour les arbres ou l'objectif global?
Les émissions de gaz à effet de serre.
En ce qui concerne les forêts ou
de façon générale?
De façon générale. Alors, ce programme-ci avait un petit effet sur leur cible de 2030. Comme j'ai dit en anglais, ça ne va pas arriver parce que ça va prendre plus longtemps pour le stockage de carbone dans ces arbres. Ça veut dire qu'ils vont besoin de trouver d'autres sources de réduction d'émissions pour atteindre leur cible de 40 à 45 %. Ce rapport-ci, ce n'est pas un rapport global sur tous les aspects de leur plan. À l'automne, je vais déposer un autre rapport qui va regarder les autres programmes. Je peux dire maintenant qu'il y a des lacunes dans leur plan avec les forêts. Avec le secteur pétrolier et gazier, il y a des lacunes dans leur plan et nous aurions plus de détails sur ça dans notre dépôt de l'automne.
De façon générale, vous en avez parlé un peu en anglais. Comment vous qualifieriez la mise en œuvre des engagements du gouvernement en matière environnementale?
Alors, principalement, depuis 1992, avec la conférence à Rio sur le changement climatique et la biodiversité et les conventions, c'est l'histoire du Canada et beaucoup de bons mots et pas assez d'action. C'est une série d'échecs depuis 30 ans maintenant. Des échecs en ce qui concerne la réduction de gaz à effet de serre et en ce qui concerne la biodiversité, incluant les espèces en péril.
Et ça se poursuit selon vous sous le gouvernement actuel? Beaucoup de bons mots, pas d'action?
C'est une histoire constante depuis 30 ans. Pas d'assez d'action, beaucoup de bons mots, beaucoup d'engagement, beaucoup de programmes, beaucoup de plans, mais on a besoin de résultats maintenant.
Boris Proulx, Le Devoir.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux comprendre à la lecture de votre rapport sur les 2 milliards d'arbres que c'est une mauvaise idée d'offrir aux personnes, aux partenaires qui plantent ces arbres, de vendre des crédits compensatoires pour les émissions de gaz à effet de serre des entreprises polluantes dans un marché du carbone?
Alors, l'idée des crédits, il y a beaucoup de controverses. Est-ce que le résultat est de réduction réelle ou est-ce qu'on seulement change les émissions d'un site à l'autre? nous avons des détails dans le rapport où nous avons des concerns que si les crédits ne sont pas faits dans une manière avec substance, que ça peut avoir l'effet de seulement changer le site des émissions au lieu de vraiment stocker le carbone. Alors, c'est possible, le système de crédit peut fonctionner, mais c'est les détails qu'on n'a pas vu jusqu'à maintenant, les détails qui sont importants. Est-ce que ce sont des réductions réelles ou non? Et ça, c'est la question.
Est-ce que ce serait aussi bien vous interpréter, toujours sur la question des arbres, que de dire que ce programme-là n'est pas réellement cohérent, en tout cas à court terme, avec le projet de réduire les GES, mais que selon vous, il pourrait être utile pour la biodiversité, les espèces en péril, donc les autres préoccupations là, de votre bureau?
Ça peut être utile pour tous les deux, le changement climatique, la biodiversité et aussi le bien-être humain, la troisième. Ce que j'ai dit, c'est pour la cible de 2030, ce programme ne va pas avoir les réductions des émissions prévues. Ça va avoir des réductions avec le stockage de carbone, mais plus tard, quand les arbres sont beaucoup plus grands, ils peuvent stocker beaucoup plus de carbone. Je ne dis pas que c'est un programme inutile. Ça ne va pas avoir le bénéfice pour 2030 en ce qui concerne le changement climatique. Ça peut avoir des bénéfices plus tard. Et si la mise en œuvre est bonne, ça peut aussi avoir des bénéfices pour le bien-être humain et la biodiversité si on utilise le programme pour restaurer les habitats et pas seulement planter des arbres.
OK, on va maintenant passer sur Zoom. So we will start with Mia Rapson from the Canadian Press.
Yeah, good morning. I'm wondering, in terms of the trees, why is it taking the government so long each year to say, like, they're not going to say until June what they actually planted last year? So I'm wondering if you think that time frame is too long. And I'm also wondering, when it comes to the agreements you mentioned that they've started to sign with provinces, if you've had a chance to look at them and think that those agreements will be enough to overcome some of the challenges you've identified.
So we're just in April, so I'm not going to criticize them for not having the exact numbers for 2022 just yet. It's not out of the realm of possibility to be taking 6 months to get the final data, because they were relying on partners to deliver most of the program. Not much of it is happening on federal land, and so they need to get that data. And then the second question was?
Just if you've had a chance to look at any of these agreements they've signed with provinces and think they're good enough to overcome the problems you've identified.
Yeah, so none of these agreements at this stage will make a big dent into the 2 billion trees. But if they are the first in a series of agreements, and there's two types. There's agreements in principle, of which they've added several since we even finished the report a couple of months ago. Finished the audit period a couple of months ago. They've reached more agreements in principle with the provinces. And then, as announced this week, the department is signing new contribution agreements, which are the real agreements that have specified numbers of trees to be planted per year. They're still just in the early stages, so nothing that they're signing right now will guarantee anything close to 2 billion trees. But if they catch up, sign these agreements, get the other provinces on board that haven't signed agreements, and do that catch-up exercise, it is still possible to do it. They're off to a slow start, but from what I've heard this week with their new announcements, they are taking our report seriously, and we'll see whether they follow that up with the necessary actions on the ground.
Thank you. And on the report on the regulations and emissions, they say that it's just not possible to attribute specific emissions cuts to any particular regulation. Do you think it should be possible?
It is possible in a general sense. We know that even estimating total emissions in Canada, they have to update that year by year, even for past years, because it's not an exact science. It's not about counting widgets that one can see. But you can run, one can run the models with different variables held constant and other variables pulled out. So you could run the model without, for example, the methane regulation and see what the result is, and then you can run it with the methane regulation. It's not an exact science, though. I mean, this whole area of sensitivity analysis is difficult to explain here in a few words, but the idea is to at least get a handle on whether all of the many elements of their emissions reduction plan, and there are dozens and dozens of elements, if when you run the models with them, whether it actually adds up or not, and whether you are getting the benefits that you had foreseen. So it is possible. There's going to be it's going to be subject to some uncertainty, but the fact that there's some uncertainty isn't a reason to just not do it at all. They ran these models to roll out these regulations, right? The regulations came with projections about the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas reductions that they would achieve. So they run them at the outset. What we're saying is rerun them while they're in place to see, for example, now in 2023, whether you're getting the reductions, and if you aren't, you're going to have to, like they are going to have to with 2 billion trees, find real reductions elsewhere to achieve a target. We say this in the context of 30 years of them missing every target. So the just trust us, it'll all add up, doesn't work until they actually start showing that they're able to meet a target. When they start meeting targets, then I'll be more confident in their ability to model their plans and so on. Right now, they don't deserve the benefit of the doubt after 30 years of missing targets.
Marc-André Cossette, Global.
Good morning. Thanks for taking our questions. In answering a question from one of my Francophone colleagues, you did seem a little frustrated by, I think, the lack of action that we've seen in efforts to fight climate change. I think you suggested that we've heard a lot of promises but have seen very little in the way of concrete actions. Is that accurate to describe you as somewhat frustrated by your findings?
I'm absolutely frustrated and disappointed with Canada's track record. We're the only G7 country that has higher emissions now than when we started the endeavor of stabilizing and then decreasing emissions back in 1992. So our emissions curve, it's not a matter of, oh, we're falling short of our reductions and we're getting fewer reductions than we hoped for. We haven't had any reduction. We're up 14% since 1990. All the other G7 nations are down in their emissions, some of them by quite a bit. So there is no track record of Canadian emission reductions. There's only been a track record so far of increases in greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks for that. And for my follow-up, just picking up on Mia's question, in terms of the greenhouse gas regulations, can you explain why it's important that the government be able to demonstrate the effect of each of those regulations?
So they have a portfolio of different measures, including multiple regulations, the carbon price, and so on. On paper, in their emissions reduction plan, it adds up to 40% reduction as is the target. But their previous plans have added up to the previous targets. But when we get to those years, including 2020, which we just got the data for last year, they don't meet those targets, even though they had plans that added up in the design phase. So what we're saying is, in the implementation phase, keep doing the modeling and seeing where you're falling behind, and therefore amp up other measures that will compensate for it. If you just roll out and say, well, it looked good on paper and we're disappointed after 10 years that it didn't work, that's not continuous improvement, that's not adaptive planning, that's not doing what's necessary to achieve a target. So what we're saying is, you do have the tools to model as you go to make sure you're on track. And I should add that I'm not alone in recommending this. The government's own advisory body on climate change also recommends improvement in parsing out the various measures to see whether they're on track, so that you can add up to see whether it adds up, in this case, to 40 to 45% by 2030. So it's about monitoring and course correcting and being accountable throughout implementation, rather than just talking about good plans and having good words on paper.
Okay, we'll go to Inayat Singh, CBC News.
Hi, thank you. This is Anayat Singh from CBC in Toronto. I had a question about the report on forests and climate change, about one of your recommendations that NRCan and ECCC should consider reporting emissions from logging separately. I wanted to ask, if the departments did commit to that. It was a little unclear from the responses if they have committed to reporting logging emissions.
Yeah, the responses to our many recommendations, some of them are better than others. I'm quite disappointed by their lack of agreement to our recommendation relating to dovetailing tree planting with habitat restoration work. I think that's a win-win proposition, even if it does mean that Natural Resources Canada would have to work with Environment Canada outside of their silo in order to obtain those benefits. In terms of logging and the whole area of properly accounting for forests in climate change, you'll see that they are willing to revisit their approach, and I'm told that they have begun an engagement as of this week to look at their approach. So I don't know, based on their response, there's no guarantee they would do it, but my understanding is that they are going to at least look at that approach, and we'll hear more from them when they deliver their action plan associated with their responses, which has more detail than the responses themselves. So we'll have to stay tuned to see whether they become more transparent about the role of logging in greenhouse gas emissions. We point out that there's not enough transparency now, especially in the example of slash burning associated with forestry, for example.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you for that. And on the same point, you also recommend that forest sector emissions should be reported by province and territory. But according to Natural Resources Canada and ECCC, that provincially disaggregated data is not reported because one province prefers it to remain confidential. Which province is this?
So you can contact the department directly to find out if the identity of the province and whether that's still the case. At the time of our audit, they indicated to us that there was one holdout, and so it's best to check with the department to see whether that's still the case. In terms of transparency, obviously our preference would be, like with emissions from the other sectors that are found in the National Inventory Report, that you can sort by province, that forestry, like the other sectors, should be subject to the same sort of transparency by province, so that we can see who's making progress and who isn't. But please contact the department to find out whether there still is one holdout and whether they're taking any steps to address that.
Parfait. On va terminer avec Éric-Pierre Champagne de la presse. Monsieur Champagne, est-ce que vous êtes là? On a perdu Monsieur Champagne sur la ligne. Je vais juste lui laisser quelques secondes au cas où il réapparaisse. Oui, Monsieur Champagne, est-ce que vous êtes là? Vous pouvez...
Oui, c'est j'ai.
OK,
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend maintenant.
Désolé, je pense que j'avais un problème avec la connexion. Oui, donc, en fait, comment vous expliquez le fait que le gouvernement...
On ne vous entend plus.
Dans les trois cas, c'est des pressions externes. Alors, comment vous expliquez ça? Que ça nécessitait des pressions externes pour qu'il y ait des décrets d'urgence qui soient pris par le gouvernement?
Je n'ai pas entendu toute la question, mais je sais que la question, c'est sur notre rapport numéro 3 sur le pouvoir discrétionnaire pour protéger les espèces en péril. Et je crois que la question est pourquoi il y a seulement 3 décrets et tous les 3 décrets dans 20 ans d'inaction sur les espèces en péril. Pourquoi sont des pressions externes? Alors, ça, c'est la constatation de notre audit, que l'environnement changement climatique Canada n'a pas un système proactif pour sauver les espèces en danger avec des risques imminents. Il répond quand il y a des pressions externes. Ça, c'est un programme réactif. Ils ont besoin d'avoir un programme proactif pour qu'ils puissent sauver ces espèces en péril.
Est-ce que vous aviez un suivi? Bon, il ne semble pas y avoir de suivi, donc sur ce, on va conclure la conférence de presse. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Commissaire, pour votre temps. On apprécie.
Et merci à vous. Thank you all.